Hello, and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. The following story is part of the Edie Valley Project. Link to the playlist in the description below. Yes, you have to read them all. No, that is not a request. So today I am here to introduce a new sub-arc thing. I don't know. I had an idea and I went with it, and it's gonna fit into the larger canon. Don't worry, it's not just a random track into something else, but it won't seem like it's related to a long time, so forgive me. But I think you'll enjoy it. So without further ado, here is New Acquaintances plus an informative history of Atlantis. Over the next few weeks, both Cindy and Marcel began to open up to each other. They were careful not to get too physically close at school. Cindy didn't want Marcel to lose his job, after all, but they talked more freely. Cindy talked about the gap between their acquaintance, about the last year and her time in a mental ward. Marcel discussed more about his curse, as he called it, but most importantly, he finally began to realize why he had come to Edie Valley in the first place. "I don't want to get you involved," he insisted after she wheedled him for the 100th time. "Why not?" "Because it's not necessary." He crossed his arms and frowned. "There's no point in risking your life just to know the Jeopardy answer to why Lucius Marcel is an idiot." "Okay," Cindy countered, "but if you're involved in something dangerous, shouldn't I know about it? You know, in case someone else decides to get me involved?" "Well, besides, how do you know I'm not already involved? I could be knee-deep in whatever it is, and you wouldn't even know about it." "But you're not." Marcel did not look amused. She tilted her head. "How do you know? I'm involved in a lot of things." "Like what?" "I've got a mob boss in training as my next-door neighbor." Marcel blinked. "You what?" "You heard me." She smirked, putting her hands on her hips. "The heir to a mob family is squatting in the next-door house that I bewitched to be abandoned in exchange for rare ingredients." "I should be wildly concerned about this, but I'm actually really impressed, so well done." Cindy began to smile before he interrupted her. "But I'm still not telling you." "Why not?" "Because, well," he struggled. "You're going to make a habit of doing this, aren't you?" She grinned. "Of what?" "Dismantling all of my arguments before I can make them." He shook his head, sighing. "But you might be right. Sort of. So I'll tell you a little, but not here." Lowering her head, Cindy glanced back and forth across the classroom in mock paranoia. "Why? Because they could be watching?" "No," he grouched, "because it's kind of complicated and I'm not the biggest expert, and there is no they." Luckily, the day was hopelessly downcast, and in the middle of November, Marcel would hardly look out of place with a large coat and hat. They agreed to leave after school ended. "You can at least tell me where you're taking me. It's not into your windowless van, is it?" Cindy asked, only half joking. "Of course not." Marcel smiled a little. "We're going to the East Branch." "The East Branch?" Cindy's brow furrowed. "You mean the library?" Shrugging, Marcel placed his large brim hat onto his head. "You can call it that if you like, but it's not a library." "What, just because no one goes there?" Cindy followed him out the door. "Because it's actually a dragon's hoard." Cindy blinked. "Excuse me?" "I think I would know if there was a dragon living in my boring suburb." "Dragons are old beings with very powerful magic," Marcel said sagely. "She doesn't usually look like a dragon." "Wow, now you've just got me excited." Cindy grinned as she pushed open the school's front door. The East Branch was one of the 2 libraries in Edie Valley, the other one being known by the obvious title of the West Branch. This latter branch was far newer and nicer than its eastern counterpart, and had a much larger selection of books and other materials, so no one really went to the East Branch anymore, though it still technically remained open. No one, that is, except Marcel, apparently. As they walked the few blocks to the rather dark, gloomy East Branch, Cindy meditated on the growing weirdness of her life. She had no way of knowing, of course, that this was only the beginning. The East Branch was an old, round building with a peaked roof and dark windows. It seemed as if the sky itself darkened as they approached. Cindy hesitated, suddenly feeling very uneasy. "That anxiety you're feeling now?" Marcel began as she paused. "Ignore it. She does that on purpose to scare people away." "The dragon," Cindy breathed, "is making me anxious?" "Yes." He took her hand, and together they walked into the heavy interior. Beyond, the room was echoey and round, with tall, spindly bookshelves lining the walls. Everything was coated in a faded shade of blue from the clouds poking out of the largely glass ceiling. Yet it was more with awe than with trepidation that Cindy glanced around the room, for Marcel had been right. Most of her sudden anxiety had faded as soon as she stepped through the threshold. "Wow," she whispered, her voice small against the weight of the books. "You know, I don't think I've actually ever been in here before." But before Marcel could respond with a no doubt sarcastic quip, a head poked out of one of the doors lodged between the shelves with an odd clicking sound. The head tilted to the side, staring at them for a second, before a body joined it and began to walk towards Cindy and Marcel in interest. It was a boy, probably no older than 15. He was dressed oddly, in a white long-sleeved shirt under a button-down, which had numerous pineapples sprinkled across its patterned front. He didn't say anything, just continued to approach with an oddly blank expression on his face. "Hello," Cindy waved. "Do you work here?" Then, under her breath to Marcel, added, "You said the dragon was a she, right?" The boy just continued to stare. Are you all right?" Cindy asked. "He won't respond," said a new voice, coming vaguely from behind a desk stacked feet high with orderly stacks of books and scrolls. Marcel smiled as a short, dark-haired woman in a blue sweater stepped beyond it. She was one of those people who was probably nearing 60, but you couldn't really tell because there was nary a wrinkle in sight. It gave her an ageless quality, and Cindy silently prayed that she would look that good at that age. "Ah, Cindy, this is Orem." Marcel nodded to the woman. "She's the owner of this collection. Good afternoon." Ah, so this was the dragon. She didn't look very intimidating, but Cindy guessed that that was the point. Orem smiled. "Likewise. A little early for you, isn't it, Lucius?" Cindy did not miss the familiarity between them. "And who's your friend?" Orem winked in Cindy's direction. "I'm Cindy Miller. I'm a witch." She took a step forward before Marcel got a chance to speak. "What do you mean he won't respond?" she added, turning back to the boy. Approaching the boy with a kind expression, Orem put her hands on his shoulders. The boy didn't acknowledge this in any way. "This is Service. He's an automaton." As she blinked, Cindy frowned. She'd heard the word before, but didn't know its meaning. An automaton? He's a robot, I guess you could say, made primarily out of clockwork. Some of them can speak, but not this one, I'm afraid. It's frankly surprising. He's one of the most advanced specimens I've ever come across. She patted Service on the head like he was some antique car. He blinked once, but still didn't move. "And you see a lot of automatons?" Cindy added. "I'm a collector of all sorts of ancient things," Orem smiled. "It's sort of my obsession, if you will. But not so much more with automatons. I found this one while I was flying over the Atlantic, floating in the middle of nowhere, completely waterlogged. They're largely Atlantean constructions, you know. There's a reason they were the most advanced city on Lemuria." "Wait, did you just say Atlantis?" After pausing in surprise, Orem turned back to Marcel with a frown. "Lucius, do you mean to say you haven't told her about Atlantis yet?" "I taught her half a semester on it," he said sheepishly, "but I don't think she really listened." Cindy sighed. "I was 16 and didn't believe you." "You're much better at explaining it than I am anyway," Marcel added. They both turned to Orem expectantly. She shook her head, looking very disappointed. "Service, be a dear and get the Atlantis books, the usual ones, please." He nodded once, before jogging mechanically off through the large metal door he'd initially appeared from. "I hate that name," Marcel said unexpectedly, watching the boy leave. "Why did you name him that, of all things?" "For irony's sake." Orem grinned widely, revealing surprisingly large, sharp teeth for a woman of her size. "Oh, yes, dragon, right." For a moment, Cindy was confused. Cindy was confused before she remembered she knew Latin. "Wait, does that word mean what I think it means?" she asked, glancing back and forth between the two. "My sense of humor is not for everyone, I'm afraid," Orem admitted. "Now," she shook herself, "Atlantis was a city on the continent of Lemuria, which sank into the sea countless years before Sumer or Egypt were a glint in some farmer's eye. It was incredibly advanced for 4000 BCE, and so much knowledge was lost when it sank. Unfortunately, no one knows exactly why the continent was lost." Just then, Service returned with a small stack of books, which he carried with ease despite his lack of musculature. "Ah, yes, thank you." Orem smiled as Service nodded once more, and then stood amongst the others with an expression that could be mistaken for mild interest. "Where was I?" She blinked several times. "Ah, of course, the knowledge of Atlantis would have been lost forever, had it not been for a Roman historian who followed a trail of obscure clues that eventually led him to discover the continent's existence. Though no one really knows for certain, some say he found the city itself. But that may not have been his biggest find. This historian also uncovered a legend which speaks of something known as the Truth. No one really knows what it is, but it seems to hold some great power and danger." Cindy nodded, but frowned. "That's all very interesting, but What does that have to do with Edie Valley? And here Marcel took over. About 60 years ago, a group of archaeologists found something near the coast of Britain that we have reason to believe may be related to this truth. And do you think that something found its way here? Cindy concluded. But how do you know all of this? We're not the only ones seeking the truth, Orem admitted. Some of us work together. Cindy nodded, taking it all in. At the very least, these two believed what they were saying, and though she didn't know Orem all that well, Cindy trusted Marcel. One more question, if you don't mind. She paused before Orem nodded her consent. Why are you two looking for it in the first place, if it's so dangerous? Why does anyone seek the truth? Marcel answered with a question of his own. Though she could guess some of the things he may have been implying, Cindy decided that it was not a good time to bring them up. I suppose you're right, she said instead. Thank you. She turned to Orem now, too. Thanks for telling me all of this. My powers aren't terribly advanced yet, but if you think there's anything I can do to help, don't hesitate to ask. Perhaps I will. Orem began to smile before Marcel cut her off with a red glare, though it could be very dangerous. Now, Lucius, she changed the subject, you wanted that medieval manuscript, didn't you? I believe it's in the vault. Service knows where it is. The automaton almost seemed to sigh with mild annoyance before leading Marcel through the thick door on the other side of the circular room. Don't mind him. Orem leaned on her desk and rolled her eyes as soon as the door shut. He doesn't mean to be overprotective, but when you're as old as he is, let alone me, it's hard to see someone with a normal lifespan as anything but a child. Well, I guess I'll have to make that change then, Cindy breathed, determined. Orem grinned. That's the spirit. She reached into the stack of Atlantis books that Service had brought, and sneezed a small spurt of flame as the dust from the old tomes reached her nose, though she turned out of the way with an expert motion. That was a close one, she sighed, pulling out a thin, leather-bound book. Now, don't discount what Lucius said, she intoned. This hunt for the truth is incredibly dangerous, but if you're still interested, that should never stop you from pursuing knowledge. I'll let you borrow this. Smiling, she placed the book in Cindy's hands. Cindy returned the grin. Thank you. She hid the book in her coat as Marcel returned, and the two shortly thereafter departed. She didn't tell him about the book, not on the walk back towards the school, nor when they split up and Cindy walked the rest of the way home. Though she knew that it was probably a stupid thing to do, that it could get her into trouble, her interest had been piqued. She had to know more. That night, Cindy opened the creaking, yellowed pages for the first time, intending to read just a few pages before bed. She didn't shut off the light until 3 the next morning. The book was a diary written by a Roman historian, presumably the one mentioned by Orem on his quest to discover Atlantis. The original must have been written in Latin, because this was apparently a translation into English. Cindy guessed it was Orem's work. The diary detailed the historian's search as he pursued a vague trail of clues and hearsay over the course of many months. Eventually he seemed to have pinpointed the location, for he procured a sailing vessel and sailed from the coast of Britain. But to Cindy's dismay, the diary ended before the historian told if he had actually found it. All there was a letter. To whoever reads this, it began, and to all those who seek the truth, know that the path ahead of you will be long and difficult, and that your very humanity will be brought into question along the way. There are some things that man is not meant to know, lest he be driven mad with the knowledge, his soul split threefold. But to those desperate enough to succeed, who have looked inside themselves and seen the abyss, the truth is almost in your grasp. And below, in a nearly intelligible scrawl, the name of the author was written. Lucius Marcellus. Of course it was. She didn't know how she hadn't guessed that in the first place. After that, there was only one more thing before the last page. A fable, the one that had apparently started Marcel in his quest in the first place, and one he often referenced in the diary. It was simply titled, Morna and the Truth.